I'm going to introduce Jem, who is, I think, recognised as one of the greatest photographic artists we have in the UK.
Well, be careful.
You're never going to agree to that, are you?
Yeah.
And he's going to take you through several bodies of his work this afternoon, and to try and use those as a way of illustrating his approach to photography, his ethos in photography. And I think it will be a fascinating and really eye-opening thing for lots of you. For me, the great tragedy about Jem's work is it doesn't translate well into a book or into images on the net. It really needs to be seen as a print, and that's when you can understand what it's about. Which sadly means that unless you get the chance to see his work as an exhibition, and there are a couple of his prints out the front, you're probably not going to appreciate the depth of what he's doing.
I try with books.
Yeah, but they're not big enough.
No, okay. I'll try it. Yeah.
Where's David Breen? Triple Kite, big book.
Yeah.
So, without further ado, Jem Southam.
Okay, thank
Hands
you very
together,
much,
ladies and
David.
gentlemen.
Yeah. And thank you very, very much for the invitation to come and speak here and come up to Penrith and share this fascinating two days. I've had a great time so far. One of the things that I love about sort of getting older as a photographer is that I thought at first why I really loved photography was because I like going out and making pictures, which is obviously the case. But over the last 5-10 years, I've realized that one of the things I really love about it is that it's introduced me to some really wonderful people. And meeting people here, these opportunities are just great. Fantastic talk from Raphael. There was lots and lots of things I found really interesting about what he said, and there was a lot of congruence between what I'm going to say and what he said, and I'm going to be using some of the same kind of phrases and terms, but there was one point that I fundamentally disagree with him about, and that is that I am absolutely passionate about the photographic process, the medium. It absolutely, from when I first started working, and I'm sure many of you will share this, light, physics, chemistry, what happens when these little boxes, when Fox Talbot got his little boxes and coated bits of paper and stuck them and started putting them in places and windows, the whole exploration of what photography is and what it can do, I find absolutely kind of wonderful. So that's my starting point, the very simple fact, I just like going out with a little box and sticking it somewhere in the world and just seeing what happens. That's what I love doing. Rockfalls River, Ponds River mouth, that's relatively straightforward. That's largely what I'm going to be talking about. A clamor of voices, maybe not so. So I'm going to just briefly try and introduce that. So we've heard a little bit about the sublime romanticism. And goodness knows what Caspar David Friedrich was thinking about when he was painting this picture between 1817 and 1818. He was a bit of a religious mystic, apparently, and also depressive. But subsequent generations and me today, I want to think about us, and I mean, this is the wanderer above the mist, but really this is all of us, this is mankind. We've climbed now to the top of Olympus. We've joined the gods, or we now are the gods, looking down at the world and contemplating the world and our place within it. From the middle of the 18th century, the idea of creation as something provided for us by a divine hand was steadily, or had been steadily, eroded, and in its place, views of the world, narratives, constructs of the world, coming out of a questioning, empiricism, observation, reasoning, what we call the Age of Enlightenment, building kind of new narratives that explained the world and our position. And those narratives sort of come out of the natural sciences, but they also come out of the humanities, and they come out of kind of philosophy. And there's room, yes, for the divine and the spiritual, but also going back to David's talk this morning, also the fact that we're human animals. There's an awful lot embedded in us that's to do with the sort of 2 million year or so evolution of us of animals. And as we are sort of standing and looking out at the world, this is my kind of approach anyway, this is where I come from. When we open our eyes and look at the world, we are absolutely flooded, our minds are absolutely flooded by what I call a clamor of voices. these sort of narratives. So would they come to us as we're growing up, first from our parents and from our families, through the processes of education, through all the films that we ever looked at, all the pictures, books we've ever looked at, all the posters, all the paintings, all the novels, all the histories. And so a few years ago I started, I'm not going to do it to you today, occasionally giving talks where I would sort of list to undergraduate students some of the big influences in my life. And I used to start off with Thomas the Tank Engine. I was shocked to realize when I had kids and I started rereading Thomas the Tank Engine and Noddy books, how powerful the imagery was that I'd been sort of absorbing through all those early years. And it's still in there, and it's still feeding my imagination. And so what I find absolutely fascinating is to make work that allows me to sort of dwell on this clamor of voices that are coming through me. A lot of it, the universality that Raphael was talking about, but each one of us is just sort of lives a life full of these. Whoops, this is this jumping thing. But to put that in a slightly different way and come at that from a slightly different direction, I'm just going to use this picture. This is the one picture from Cumbria that I'm going to show you. I made a piece of work along the Cumbrian coast between about 2005 and 2008, and here I was standing on a slag heap north of Barrow with a man called Nick Allfrey, an art historian, wonderful art historian who teaches at Nottingham University. He's incredibly well informed about the history of English landscape and painting and literature. And he stood there with me and he said, "Oh, that's Black Combe, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, yeah." And he said, "Well, you know that Wordsworth poem from Black Combe," which I didn't. So that evening, we sort of went out and we dug out this fantastic title, listen to this, written with a slate pencil on a stone on the side of the mountain of Black Combe. And the reason he points out, Wordsworth walked up Black Combe, but the thing that we're really fascinated by is the bit at the top of this second page, where he says, "Know, if thou grudge not to prolong thy rest, that on the summit whither thou art bound, a geographic labourer pitched his tent with books supplied and instruments of art to measure height and distance, lonely task week after week." So Wordsworth came across a very, very early cartographer working on the top of Black Combe, and he incorporated this sort of narrative into this poem. And what Nick Allfrey and I found so fascinating about this was that we thought about this idea of being a geographic labourer, that all of us really are geographic labourers, be we art historians or painters or geographers or physical geographers or whatever, and we're all working away, we're beavering away in our own tiny little ways, asking our own questions, working with our own kind of methods, but we're all fascinated by this vast, vast sort of topic, which is the earth, it's, you know, and our understanding of being here. So I liken myself to being I love this idea of being just a geographic labourer, a very kind of democratic, proletarian sort of role. So I come to landscape thinking along these lines. I'm going to show you some bodies of work now that try and open up some of this. And unlike some of the speakers, I'm not going to dwell a lot on individual pictures, but sort of go through them. I'm going to show a lot of pictures. So this is a little series called The Garden. It's my garden. We moved into this house in about 1994, I think, when my second child was born. And one day, about a year later, I came down to breakfast and looked out the window and just felt, oh, I must get my camera. So this is shot on a 10-8 camera. I get the camera and just made this picture, looking out the window of the garden, and made a contact print and stuck it on the wall. And about a year later, or 9 months later, I came down. I thought, oh, I must do this again, and I took another picture. And this is how I make work. I very rarely sort of set off with a direct sense of purpose. I basically fix on sites, what I call sites or places, and I make kind of prolonged studies over sometimes a year, sometimes 2 years. This is an 18-year piece of work. I finished it last year. I just decided to put it to bed for a reason which I'll explain a bit later on. I've never shown it. I've got no plans to show it, but it's been an absolutely engrossing piece of work. So I fix on a site and I photograph it, go back and back and back. There's no pattern, there's no rhythm, there's no plan. I don't go back each month. It's quite accidental how often I repeat it. The sites vary in size enormously between the coast of Cumbria, which I was describing to you just now, and this garden. Some of them are a bit smaller even. So I begin to what I call unpack the site. What's going on here? It's just a garden. Well, it's not just a garden, is it? First of all, it's a sort of a model of a paradisical space. It's a walled, protected space in which one can sort of nurture and look after a family. It's a Victorian garden. It was before that an orchard, providing food for the citizens of the city of Exeter, about a mile away. But now it's a sort of 20th or 21st century garden. And I'm looking out the window and I'm thinking about the fact that I cursed this bloody garden. Because the mortgage I had to take on to buy the garden is just continuously, I'm doing the washing up, this is just by the sink, bearing down on my imagination. My wife and I both come from middle class families. We wanted a nice big garden, and for 15 years, you know, it was a real burden. But it's also a place where, for instance, I think about my relationship with my parents, who were both gone by the time this work was started. My mother, who was very keen on with plants and gardens. My father was an ornithologist, or very keen on birds. So that one of the things I did with this garden is I had feeders and bird feeders, and tried to encourage all sorts of different sort of birds into the garden. I tried to, you know, grow plants the best I could. But it's also something where I'm musing on the fact that the modern garden has been completely transformed, for instance, by garden centres. You know, the garden centre, which 25 years old, has radically altered what gardens have become in Britain over the last few years. So, you know, kind of furniture and all these sort of things are transformed. So something about modern culture and society. But really, fundamentally, one of the things that's been fascinating to explore making these pictures, two things really, whoops, we're jumping, was first of all that I have this little theory, not just mine, that basically anywhere on Earth, every site, everywhere we go, everywhere we put our foot down is a contested space. There's nowhere that isn't contested. So even in a little place like this, which is a protected haven, one has conflict. It's not just a sort of a beautiful, calm and nurturing place. So to give you an example, when we moved into the house, I had about a year or two later, the neighbour came round, the man living on the right-hand side, a man called Mr. Cross, Derek Cross. He came round and said, "Jem, could I have a chat with you a minute?" And I said, "Sure, what's the matter?" And he said, "Your kids." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "That bloody trampoline." He said, "Every time they bounce on the trampoline, they're going, 'Hello, Mr. Cross, Mr. Capri,' you know. Can you please put up a piece of trellising?" So the trellising is there explicitly to, you know, protect. The neighbour on the other side came round about a year or two later and said, "Look, this big tree here, I don't know if this is pointing, I won't use this big tree on the left." She said, "I want it down. You know, we're having problems with the wall." And I said, "I'm not cutting that down." And she said, "Why not?" And I said, "Well, because it's my tree, and anyway, it's going to spoil the composition of my whole set of pictures if I take that tree down, you know." And also, even more importantly than that, it's a key place where the birds come in, and I bring the birds in. It's part of the feeding kind of mechanism in the garden. And, you know, complicated relationships. But sorry, I don't know why this keeps hopping. But we had badgers in the garden about 4 or 5 years ago. The first badger appeared right in the middle of the city. And we didn't see it, but we saw signs of the badgers. Our first reaction was, "This is absolutely wonderful. I would happily kill the thing now." It just digs and digs and digs and digs holes in our garden. We feed the birds, we loathe the neighbour's cats. It's just an endless sense of struggle. I have ideas about what I want to do, my wife has ideas about what I want to do. You know, so anyway, a contested site. But something else also, for me, very poignant, and a lot of, you know, I like the idea of putting a lot of pathos into the work. Suddenly the swing's gone. We're 5 or 6 years into this, my kids are growing up. The whole thing becomes a portrait of an autobiographical space where narratives are unfolding and so on. So I've shot about 50, 60 pictures over 18 years, maybe more. I've never organized them into any kind of shape, but it's been a wonderful and fascinating experience. And something else that, you know, it's been very interesting about, which we should never forget. Again, I sort of slightly disagree with Raphael about this. I think photography is about light. I think light's our medium. You know, if a painter paints, if a sculptor uses stone, we use light. And I think, aren't we lucky? We're the luckiest buggers on earth, because what is more wonderful than exploring the unbelievable richness and potency of light and atmosphere? So each one of these is very much an individual picture. Look, the tree's gone. It had to come down eventually. And also the kids' climbing frame has gone down. Anyway, and also a celebration of sort of, English weather, English atmosphere, well, not Devon, and seasons. So that gives you some idea. So we're hopping. Didn't mean to hop. Gives you some idea. Look, the garden furniture kind of appears as well. About what I call unpacking the site. Just very quietly looking out at somewhere, making pictures. The same focal length lens. The camera is balanced on top of an upturned washing up bowl each time. I'm not bothered too much about what happens with sort of horizons. If the window's wet and rainy, then that happens. It's all because I love that's about what photography is. It's just looking and whatever's out there basically, comes onto the film. So that's just trying to give you an explanation. So I'm now going to talk very briefly about this piece of work. I'm not going to go through this in that much detail, but I just want to make a point or to open up this idea of a clamor of voices, because this was the first piece of work which I made in Camborne, where I was living between 1982 and about 1987, 88. Got my first teaching job, working part-time, and for the first time in my life I was earning some money and I had 2 or 3 days a week to actually work. And I made this work called the Red River. And it's called the Red River because I followed the little stream that ran through the valley that I was living in, which was called the Red River, and you can see it here. It's a minute little stream, never more than about sort of 2 meters wide and 1.5 meters sort of deep. And it's a tinning stream, so the water was used from this tiny stream for about 250 years to lubricate the crushing of the ore. And the residue of whatever had happened at the end of that crushing process was put back into the river, which colored it red, completely inert, poisonous, lethal kind of river, no life in there whatsoever, a lot of sediment, a lot of minerals, a lot of heavy, nasty sort of chemicals. This is a place called Tucking Mill. And I spent 5 years walking up and down this valley, thinking about making a piece of work. And one of the sort of very rich areas of practice that sort of my generation have sort of explored photographically is what one might call projects that relate to what we call local distinctiveness. Lots of people made bodies of work where they explore, the specifics of a particular area. So this started off like that, in a kind of topographic way, making a record of a landscape. This is a close-up of the stream itself. And what I wanted to do was, in a sense, push the boundaries of the way I thought about landscape, and I made pictures. So although I started off with a series of big views, after a while I got a bit frustrated with this. I said I'm not really sort of touching the sort of the heart and the core of the lives of the people living in this valley. So in a sense I wanted sort of metaphorically to sort of dive down and swim among the houses and among the small holdings and move in and out and make a series of pictures which built into a sort of a complex structured sequence of pictures. But something then else started happening which really excited me. I'd never really thought through this, and this is where the talk really sort of, in a sense, hopefully begins. And it was maybe looking at pictures like this. So I photographed this. This is a little farmhouse about a mile or so from where I was living. One evening I just got rather interested, entranced by this space. So I set this shot on a 5.4 MPP, set the camera up, made a picture. And then when I was looking at the first, second, third, fourth time looking at the print, I suddenly thought, oh, this is interesting because this picture is beginning to stir things in my mind. And I thought, well, what is it? And then I had this idea of all these stories I'd read as a kid about winter travelers traveling through the night and coming across a building and seeing a light and being led towards it. And I thought this is fascinating because this picture's, in a sense, almost like a cello. It's just strumming these memories, just very, very subtly. And this work became a study of the way that I could allow these stories. I call them kind of myths, really, narrative myths, to emerge out of my imagination and out of a relationship to a place. So here's another picture which complete accident. This, I was walking home one evening, had one neg left. This is a 6.7, so this whole work was moving between 6.7 and 5.4. I just saw this engine house, and by for some bizarre reason, there was a tungsten bulb shining behind it. I think the water ball was pumping water out during a drought. It's a misty day, and because of the peculiarities of colour film and colour temperature, the light had given me this sort of reddish glow. And again, I wasn't aware of this when I took the picture. I just liked the way that the overall composition was working. But when I looked at the print, I thought, wow, this is amazing, because it suggests almost as if this engine house has been sort of refired. And I was brought back to thinking about the sort of descriptions of places like Colebrook Ford and so on, where the early industrial revolution, people who went to these places and start describing the language that they would use to describe the noise, the smashing, the heat, the smell, and so on. Very, very evocative. And again, lodged somewhere deep in my imagination. So this picture, in a sense, starts working on that kind of level. A book that I was reading at the time, Bunyan. I come from a fairly powerful, non-conformist family. So this kind of narrative this kind of book was very much embedded in my childhood, and I was rereading it again, and realizing how potent was the language and the visual descriptions that, for instance, Pilgrim was described going through as he went on his journey. So one of the most rich descriptions in that book relates to his walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and the earth sort of grinding and splitting and cracking and belching and so on. And that picture of the mine shaft just had a tiny reference to that as well. Here's another picture made only about half a mile away from that mine shaft. And I put these two pictures together because they link up with one of the most powerful set of myths that my work in particular kind of explores, which we can see depicted in this painting here. This is a picture by a man called William Wilde. It's a painting of Manchester dating about 1855. And we've got here the confluence of two unbelievably powerful mythic narratives. We've got the pastoral going right the way back to Greek and Roman times. This depiction, this couple sort of sitting on the bank there, contemplating the industrial sublime. And the bringing together of these two narratives is something that's deeply embedded in a lot of my work. But not only that, if you're struggling to believe me, just look at this. And here, this is these two stories being brought together. This is the Olympic ceremony. I was absolutely amazed at the sort of the fact that they'd come up with this idea. So these things are so embedded in us, and whenever we're sort of looking at the world or walking through it or making pictures, I believe we have the potential to sort of feed and work on these narratives. And to give you an example of quite how powerful some of these are, look at this picture here. This really shook me up, this picture. This is a photograph made in a Methodist chapel 50 yards from where I was living in a tiny community. There were 6 houses just on the outside of Camborne, a place called Lower Conduro. Bloody bleak existence in the mid-1980s, I can tell you. This is a little offering made by the kids in the farm just above us to celebrate Harvest Festival. This is Harvest Festival in this Methodist chapel about 1984, and this is what they created. And what I found so profoundly shocking looking at this was that I knew these kids. I lived next door to the farm. They had a bleak, tough life. The farm was just a dank, dark pit of a place with howling dogs and wet and muddy. It was ghastly. And they were 6 or 7 years old. And when they came to create a farm, look what they created. They created a little cottage, and there's a little pond in front of it, some sort of Arcadian little beautiful space. Where's this come from? The picture books, storybooks, the kind of things that they would have been looking at. More powerful than the experience of actually just walking out into the yard and living in the yard that they were growing up in. So the power of these myths and the power of the way that they actually also influence us. And if I had longer, I could really, later on in the talk, go on to expand on that in the most extraordinary ways, because I think these stories and these myths have the most amazing influence on the way that we lead our lives, not just individually, but also socially as well. So this is just a few more of these pictures. And like a lot of the work that I do, in fact, almost everything I do, when I do actually like the book form, David. I do think the book form works pretty well sometimes. I like to include text and images together. So when I put this work together, it's structured around a series of narratives. So the first section deals with the idea of an origin myth. Every culture has an origin myth. We have Genesis and the Garden of Eden. A forest myth. Northwestern Europe was covered by dark forests when early humans began to sort of chop down and so on. That still pervades, Hansel and Gretel, all of this stuff buried deep in us. Arcadian myths coming again from Greek and Roman countries. So each one of these myths, and I'd use a piece of text to accompany the pictures. So also very much to do with the culture of the place. So it's a mixture of place, specificity, narrative, metaphor, and storytelling. And this was a very important picture to me. For some reason or other, fascinated by this picture when I took it. It's the confluence of the stream itself. This is the Red River. We're about a mile from the river mouth now, and another stream coming in which was non-mining, and you just see where the two rivers meet. I'm going to come back to this sort of later on. And then on the beach, this is Godreevy, Gwythian and Godreevy. You can see the stained sea. I was amazed that people used to go swimming in this water. If I went there walking with my dog, he would run in the sea and he'd come back and the staining would last on his fur for about a week or two afterwards. Goodness knows what people made of it as a place to go on holiday. I'm going to leap forward. So that's when I started thinking about the potency of these mythic narratives, as I call them. And between that Red River piece of work and the Rockfalls series I'm going to talk about in a moment, I made another piece of work called the Raft of Carrots, which was named after this picture. Rather bizarrely, these were a series of photographs of tiny little weird narratives like this that I found when I was walking mostly around Devon, where I now live, although this one was in the Fens. Just strange sort of human interventions where one's really not quite sure what's going on. But within this series, quite unintentionally, a whole series of raft images appeared, pictures where things were placed on floating kind of spaces. And I was reading a lot at the time to do with floods and flood mythology, and also referencing Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, and thinking about how a raft is about, being on a raft is about as an abject, a kind of space that one could possibly be in, not even sheltered by the sides of a boat, but just a sort of flat plank of wood, and being completely at the mercy of the sea. Because if there are a set of these narratives, these mythic narratives, that are more powerful than any others, they're frequently to do with sort of catastrophe. How humans, individually and socially, deal with the fear of catastrophe. So this is a flood image, and I was reading a lot about kind of flood mythology. And one of the things that was really extraordinary was that flood myths are prevalent in the origins of almost every culture on Earth. Something really, really interesting. Wherever you go, to sort of Aboriginal or to South America or wherever, flood mythology is incredibly kind of powerful. Why? Where does it come from? We go back to somehow or other in early human experience, really sort of seismic, traumatic kind of events probably embedded themselves deep, deep into our sort of psychosis. And if one can imagine, so when the Japanese tsunami and the earlier one in the Philippines sort of happened, you have these apocalyptic kind of events. Just imagine how many generations it's going to take for the people of northeastern Japan to somehow or other erase and forget that, the experience that they had about 2 years ago. But how these sort of get into our mind, how we deal with catastrophe. And the Rockfalls series were partly motivated by an inquiry into that. The journey into how some of these ideas evolve is rather more complicated than I have time to kind of explain here at the moment. But I started photographing these things. I call them rockfalls. Some people call them mudslides or whatever. for a number of reasons. But one of the things that fascinated me about them was that they were the place where the green swath of the English landscape suddenly and just without sort of notice collapsed and fell in. So they were at the point where the whole myth of the beauty of the sort of grass-covered downland or Greenland was suddenly shattered by a catastrophic kind of event. So they interested me from that point of view. They interested me sculpturally. I come from a background, I'm very interested in land art, the whole history of sculptural intervention in the land. And so, I'm interested in the sculptural forms. And I started photographing these this is in 1994. I've been doing, 20 years I've been photographing Rockfalls now. This is a 4-part work. And so like the others, I'd go back and photograph them repeatedly over a period of time. And so what I'm going to show you now is I've selected made 4 pictures. These are from about 30 negatives taken over 2 years. So I would go back maybe 15 or 20 times over a couple of years. And so this is just a 4-part work. And Raphael was talking not long ago about this whole idea of time. So these pictures are very much, one of the other things that very much sort of preoccupied me when I was making these was this idea of how we measure time, this idea that somehow or other we find ourselves living on Earth. We don't really know, we can't remember our birth. We don't really know where we come from. Fortunately, we don't know when we're eventually going to sort of expire. That somehow on Earth we have this idea of our lives are just lived between something and kind of nothing. And in a series of pictures like this, you have, for instance, the movement of a particular wave. These are about 1 or 2 second exposures. So you've got a wave moving up a beach. Seconds, you've got the cloud sort of wandering past here. So we're talking here about the movement of the seconds really of cloud, minutes moving along. You've got the tide line there, which comes from a sort of monthly cycle of the moon, the tide. These pictures taken over about 2 years, based deep down into 200 million years of geological history. And so time is sort of elastically sort of stretched out in all sorts of ways within this series. So I started making a lot of these small studies. And again, going back to one of the things that Raphael was talking about, was this is very much for me. So I started photographing these in 1994, and I first showed them about 6 or 7 years later. I'd never shown any of them to anybody. I just eventually went to see a gallerist who agreed to do a show. And one of the things I sort of found very bizarre, and I love about this, is that I suddenly realized after about 5 years of this, taking these things, why on earth is anybody else going to be the least bit interested in my preoccupation with these things? And I had this sort of mild panic attack that I would put on this enormous, great big show, and everybody would come and say, what the fuck is the guy doing? It's just this is absolutely pointless sort of exercise. And fortunately, a few people find them interesting, but there we are. But it's it's for me, and I've been continuing to do it, and I largely do it. I started working primarily on the South Devon coast, what's now called the Jurassic coast, and also on holiday on the Isle of Wight, where I sort of photographed them as well, and then occasionally this is in Sussex. And this is a place called Seaford Head. And something rather wonderful happened after that first exhibition, which actually in the end went down to Arles. And a guy came up to me at Arles at the Photographic Festival and said, Jem, I really like your pictures. I run a photographic agency in Normandy. You must come. I want you to come and photograph our cliffs. And I said to him, well, that sounds wonderful. It's very kind of you to ask, but I actually don't travel. I only photograph in my immediate sort of location. I'm not really interested in going around the world and making kind of pictures. Thanks very much. But fortunately, he kept persisting. And after about 2 years, he eventually persuaded me to sort of go over, and he picked me up at Rouen railway station and drove me to the North Normandy coast, and I got out the car and looked at the cliffs, and I ran back and said, "You're on, we're on. This is just absolutely kind of wonderful." So I've started photographing in 2005 the Normandy coast, and the Normandy coast is wonderful, and it's absolutely fascinating, and it's laden with rockfalls. There's an enormous number of rockfalls, but also the coast is very accessible. There's about every 4 or 5 miles there are these little valleys. I can get down and walk along backwards and forwards and find them. So I've been going there for 8, 9 years now, and photographing in Normandy. But going back to this last picture, one of the things that I've started doing, I've started realizing this is Sussex, this is Normandy. It's exactly the same rock. 12, 15,000 years ago, these two pieces of land were joined. And only 15,000 years it's taken for 60, 80 miles of gap to appear between these two sites. And so that says something else rather wonderful about time, because each one of these small rock falls might happen, a meter or two a year, the cliffs are going back. But actually, it's incredibly fast process. The speed with which the Earth is transforming is so much faster than we can really get our minds around. And there's something about looking at the world through a camera that gives you an opportunity to think about it and look at it in ways that one can't in any other way. So if I make a picture like this on a 10/8 plate camera, I don't blow them up quite this big, but blow up a print like this, one can actually sort of look at the world and think about the implications of what one's seeing in a way that you can't in any other way. If you make a film, you've got time. If you stand there, your brain is, and you're moving your head around. If you draw it, you can't deal with the complexity of all of this. And so there's something wonderful and unique about the way that the camera allows us to, in a sense, look at the world and study it within a still photograph. So I've been making a work now which is about joining these two pieces of land up, and these are just a series of some of the Normandy pictures. So I will make studies of each of these places. I'll go back and make a study of. I think I've got a few of them. Some of them exist as single pictures. So I loved this place, this rockfall when I found it. I went back about 6 months later, and the whole cliff had fallen in. So this rockfall had disappeared. So this is a little series. This is rather fascinating. I love this one. So this was taken one day in about 2006. And the day later, I went down to the beach. Very unusual. I go back a day later, and I made another picture. Whoops. And that's the picture a day later. And I was just amazed how fast the beach had actually kind of shifted, how much is going on. And again, however much one has a residual memory of what there was there yesterday, you can't quite, position it. So, the camera gives one an ability to do that. And then a year later, a huge rockfall next to it. And then about 2 years after that. So I make these small studies. This is still all ongoing. I haven't resolved this. I've been photographing these rockfalls for 18 years now, and I'm still working out how to bring the whole lot into some form of resolution. Here's another one of these series. This is a place called Vaucot. So this is about 3 years. So, I haven't a clue how we're doing for time. So, whilst I was working on these rockfalls, I started developing a couple more smaller series, coming from a similar sort of fascination with this idea of sculptural spaces. And so one series were river mouths, rather fascinating. We've seen about 6 or 8, 10 pictures of river mouths like this during the course of today. There's something wonderful, and we go back to that picture of the joining, the confluence of the two rivers. I think there's something really remarkable about where two bodies of water meet. It's a really, really fascinating kind of space. So where a river meets a sea, or where two rivers meet, I find them really fascinating places. So there was a series of river mouths, which again are what I call quite sculptural. But I also got very interested in ponds, and again, partly from a sculptural point of view, So this was a pond in Bamford Speak. There we are. I was talking about Bamford Speak earlier on today. Rather fascinating and weird declivity in the floodplain at Bamford Speak. And one of the things that interests me about ponds, apart from the sort of sculptural sort of presence of them, was the sort of the psychological and linguistic response. Because you say the word pond to people, it's a very positive, affirmative. We like ponds. They're good things. They're nice things. They're positive things. That little pond that you couldn't quite see outside the children's farmhouse, farm ponds. You know, they're really, really very positive places until you approach them. Really interesting. The closer you get to a pond, the more and more very subtly disturbed one is by them. At least that's my response to them as well. And you know what's going on there? Rather fascinating. First of all, it's a bit like a kid with a puddle. You don't know how deep the damn things are. So you get closer to a pond, there's this sort of worry as to sort of, you know, how is it going to suck you down into the earth? The American Indians, Native American Indians, believe ponds are sort of the eyes that stare up from the earth into the heavens, and that you know that what they see goes down back into the earth. Ponds are frequently places that are sort of sticky and messy and so on. We don't like. They're nice to consider, but not to go close to. So I started sort of making a series of ponds. What I wanted to do was to make a series of a sort of a typological piece where I would study about 10 or 15 ponds. Each one I wanted elliptical or circular ponds, and then create an exhibition which would be just a room full of about 10 individual portraits of ponds. I like the idea of doing that. This is one at on the Sussex Downs, Ditchling Beacon. This was the perfect model of the kind of pond I was looking for. But then again, going back to this idea about where the clamor of voices comes from, I'm frequently fascinated to see if I can. I call this the path to a picture. I organised an exhibition a few years ago at the V&A titled this, which was about tracing the narrative back through the history of the imagination to try and find out what was sort of setting off the excitement. And this is an Emerson picture, which I've always been very, very keen by, also a wintry picture, where this motif of the pond perhaps first began to sort of enter my subconscious and develop an interest. But one of the ponds that I photographed in that first series was this one here. This is a place called Upton Pine, which is about 3 or 4 miles from Exeter, and it was on the route that my wife and I used to take a cycle trip with on a Sunday afternoon. And I was always rather fascinated by this one, partly because, like many photographers, we quite like photographing kind of messes, and it was just a mess. So I stopped one day and took this picture. This was in about May 1996. And as I sometimes do, I went back, and about maybe a month later, and I was taking this picture, and this guy came up to me, and he said, "What are you doing?" I have a big plate camera. Not many people know quite what they are. You know, a big 10/8 plate camera. I'm up on a ladder on a tripod with this thing and a cloth over my head. So I'm taking a picture. He said, "Oh, you know." And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I live in the house next door. And the guy who owns this land, who's let it become, it was absolute eyesore. It was right in the middle of a little village, right? Absolutely, it was as far away from the notion of what a village pond should be as you could get. Dirty, messy, polluted, absolute tip." He said, I've got the permission to do it up. The guy who owns it has given me permission to transform it. And I said to him, "So what are you planning to do?" And he described to me the vision that he had for this pond. And as he did so, the hairs on the back of my head literally stood up, because what he was describing was basically an Arcadian dream. He wanted to transform this little space into an Arcadian paradisical space. So he described how he wanted to create boughs of trees, winding paths, put little benches so he could watch the setting and the rising of the sun, have places for his ducks, have places for his daughter's pony. And I thought, this is incredible, because here's me with my interest in the way that these narratives sort of influence us and the way that they come up through us. And here's somebody who wants to try and make the world into a space like this. So I said to him, "Do you mind if I come along and take pictures every now and again?" And he said, "Sure." So there began a fascinating sort of relationship. So I would go maybe 5, 6, 7 times a year. In 1996, I shot 10 negs. It was like young kids and working. It was quite difficult. And I just began to sort of photograph what he was doing. So this is December 1996. So he had an idea to build a pier out into the pond so he could have his little boat tied up so he could take his little rowing boat around his pond for journeys. This is a sort of a diptych. So this is taken at dawn one morning. This is the next picture. And he had a hard uphill task, this guy, because the whole pond was surrounded. As you can see here, you had a farmer who kept all his agricultural stuff, but not only that, the guy deliberately threw all his waste down into the pond. This was absolute attrition, this bloke. Anyway, so he had a tough task. So this is how they were intended to be seen, just a panoramic diptych. I rather like the sort of photographic sort of treat of this, in that you can see that I took this picture on the right about 10 minutes before I took that picture on the left, because the sun has risen and so on. Anyway, so I went back January and made this diptych. And he's begun to cover up the earth here. And I said to him, what earth's going on over here? You can see, if we go back to 2 pictures, you see there's a big shrubbery there. And then 2 pictures later, I said, what on earth are you doing? He said, I didn't want that bush. I said, yeah, but so he said, I just lit this bloody great big bonfire underneath it to get rid of it. And it very quickly became apparent that this guy was a bit of an oddball. Lovely guy, fascinating. So he started making a path look through a bower. And to give you an idea about sort of the real fascination of this, is that he wanted an island in his pond. Now, if we going back through, the history of English landscape, Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton, the development of the sort of idealized sort of classical neo-romantic kind of landscapes, everybody wanted a big water space with a little bridge, some classical buildings, and an island. This guy had embedded in his mind that he needed an island. So here's his island, and he made his island out of 2 wooden crates tied together, under which he bread baskets, those bread basket things that people carry, tie them together, turn them upside down, stuck a whole lot of plastic bottles underneath to give them buoyancy, put plastic bags on top, filled them with earth, slashed them with a knife, sprinkled grass seeds, and the grass grew up, and his ducks had somewhere to kind of roost. To make life slightly surreal, he had his island on ropes, and every now and again he kind of moved it around the pond, And also every summer, when the grass got heavy, the whole thing turned over. So there was this sort of wonderful guy with this dream and this vision. And for me, this became an allegorical piece. It's the most important piece of work I've ever done, this, by a long way. It's an allegorical piece about sort of an everyman trying to make the world a better place. And that's all what we want to do, isn't it? We just want to leave the world a slightly better place than we came into it. And here he was, just using the energy of his own hands. He didn't use any hybrid technology and his own spirit to try and make the world a better place. And the pathos of the fact is, of course, we all want to do that, but we're humans and we're going to fail. So there was this incredible drama sort of going on around it. But other things started becoming apparent, and that was as I was going out and photographing. I met, local people, and they got into conversation with me and asked me what I was doing, and I would tell them. And they really didn't like this guy. He wasn't a popular figure in the village, so he had a really tough time of it. And gradually I was accruing pictures. So for about 3 years, I'm just showing you a few of them. For about 3 years, here's a bench appearing, and he's got more ducks there and so on. Suddenly a silo, the farmer builds a great big silo there. I followed him and his progress. And this was in February 1999. We're just under 3 years into the project. And I took this picture. I might have had a conversation with him, and I've never seen him to this day. He disappeared from the village. And I was quite upset. I had about 18 or 19 negs, which I really quite liked. And I thought this was building up to be the most important and interesting piece of work I'd ever made, and he'd gone. And I was a bit bereft. I thought, oh well, it's a small piece of work. And this is the last picture I made of his sort of tenure there. This is May 1999. And to give him his due, however much he failed, however much he struggled, the one thing he really did succeed in, which I think is wonderful, is that he did succeed in turning on the ecological sort of balance of this pond. When he took it over, it was a pretty dead place. When he left 3 years later, there were herons, there were kingfishers, there were fish. And so he had succeeded in some way, even though this dream of his had come, in a sense, crashing down. What I found subsequently also interests me, going back to that myth that I was talking to you about, this pastoral and industrial. This pond is at the site of a manganese mine that was developed in 1795 by the local landowner and exploited for about 30 years, during the course of which they dug a bloody great big deep pit. And when the mine was abandoned in about 1820, that and the land around it just became, just nothing. And so it's a site of, the industrial revolution, where the pastoral sort of has begun to come back in. But anyway, about a month later, something fantastic happened. I went back, and suddenly I thought, oh, wait a minute. There's another hand. This was immediately, somebody started cutting the grass. And I knew immediately this was somebody else, because this was much, much more organized than this other guy had done. This was a much more rational and sort of organized mind. And I went back a few times, and I eventually found the guy who was doing it. He was another man from the village. And he said, oh, I've taken on the task. I've taken on the challenge. And so I said to him, do you mind if I keep photographing? And he said, no, not a problem. I didn't establish quite such a good relationship with him. And again, so I started photographing. And then something absolutely fascinating started happening, because he began to impose another mythic narrative on this same pond. And this is the one that I call improvement. Again, if you go back through the development of the English landscape, the idea of improvement that came out of enclosures, this way of the aristocracy taking over control of common land and making it more efficient, improvement in terms of efficiency. And so that meant hedging, that meant creating kind of boundaries, that meant building. So the guy built a new metal shed, he starts sort of hedging, and in a little while we'll see a little bit more about what we mean by improvement. Look at these two pictures. This is, I think this is about February 2000, and this is a year later. Whoops, sorry. So he's ripped out the little bower of trees. He's got a JCB and he's smoothed the banks. All of this used to happen. This is clearance and smoothing the banks out. The boat has now become a kind of an iconic kind of motif. His little island is now a sort of functional piece of wood. This sort of rational idea. So for the next 3 years, I photographed again and looked at the way that he was setting about transforming the world, but from an imaginative space up here partly. Something rather odd happened towards the end of this, which is just, I can tell you these stories anecdotally. I've never managed to publish this work. I've been trying to publish it for 12 years, because it is for me, it's the most interesting thing that I've ever done, because of this conjunction between all these different stories. And that was that the land was owned by a family that had sat on the land in this area of Devon for about 600 or 700 years. And the current man he was a man called Earl Lord Iddesleigh, who owned the land, was loathed locally, really unpleasant piece of work. And he hated anybody coming on his land. He did a lot of shooting and so on. You just knew as soon as you went anywhere near his territory that you weren't wanted. Not only that, you were quite aggressively thrown off. And I'm not somebody who finds it easy to transgress borders. I'm not like David, who seems to enjoy going off. So I was photographing on this guy's land without him knowing it. I sort of snuck in and out. Fortunately, he lived about a mile away. But anyway, when I came to want to sort of first show it, I had to have an engagement with the bloke. And I sort of wrote him a letter to say, I've been photographing your pond for the last sort of 6 years, and I'm making a piece of work, and I'm going to be showing it in the local museum, which is why I had to get his permission, because he was a trustee of the local museum. And so I'm writing to you to, I'll finish off that story. Here's another thing. all of this stuff, okay, the man who lived next door to the guy who did the work threw all his garden waste in the pond. So here are just trees and everything. It was just a horrible sort of complicated kind of narrative. So I wrote to this guy and said, I've been photographing this pond. He sort of wrote back and said, I want to talk to you about this. We'd better have a phone conversation. Can you ring me up? He was about 80 at the time. So I rang him up. Never spoken to him. Knew a little bit about his reputation. He was reasonably genial for the first couple of minutes. And then he said, so you've been photographing my pond from the road? And I said, no, I've been... And he just completely flipped, went absolutely bananas, and ranted for about 10 minutes on the phone. He said, I'm not going to stop you showing these. You're never going to show these. This is outrageous. This is da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And I thought to myself, well, I've spent 6 years doing this. There's no way this guy is going to stop me showing this work. But I had a little bit of a conflict. This is the last picture of the second episode. So we're 6 years in now. And it's sort of not looking too bad. But to talk a little bit about something else photographically that sort of mentioned today, this narrative does hop around. I hope you're following some of it. Amazingly enough, I got a guy in New York dealer got very, very excited by this. He saw this work and he got very excited. He said, I'd like to represent you in America because I think this work really needs to be seen. So I was more than happy. And we've had a working relationship ever since. And after a while, he said to me, look, I want to see this pond. I said, well, okay, if you want. But it's nothing special. He said, no, I want to come and see it. So he left his apartment in New York and got on a plane at JFK and flew to Heathrow and got on a train and came down to Exeter, and I picked him up and drove him out to Upton Pine 2 miles away, and he got out the car and he walked around. He came back about 10 minutes. He said, this it? You know? And I said, well, you've looked at 45 pictures of this pond pretty hard. And I said, you forget that photography is a transformative experience, process. You're not, the world, photography does not replicate what you see out there. And this in no way actually replicates what the pond looks like. But one of the other reasons that I really, really enjoyed making this work, that was the pond, the whole area of the pond was about the size of this space of this auditorium. So for 6 years, I basically went to a space this big and tried to make a new picture 5-10 times a year. And the discipline of just, trying to succeed in that was something I found very, very rich. And at the end, I also made a very small sort of epilogue to the series. And whenever I'm making a piece of work like this, I'm always thinking as soon as I know I'm on a project, I'm on a site, I'm working, I'm thinking about a book, I'm thinking about a show and how this is going to work together. And so this very much became a kind of a linear narrative with an introduction to these 2 stories. And this is the epilogue, because these are a series of pictures taken. The pond is about 5 yards just to the left, to the left here. And these are a series of pictures which take step one away from the pond because one's been very, very enclosed. You've really seen nothing throughout this series but looking into the pond. And at last we get a view down out of the valley. And this is just a small sort of epilogue. There's about 4 or 5 pictures. I've only brought a few of them. And I said 2 ponds. This is the second pond. I'm going to deal with this one very briefly, but I want to talk about it because it introduces something, another factor. So this is a second pond. This is called the Painter's Pool because in about 2001, I think I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine. I teach in an art college. This guy was a painter. There's a man called Mike Garton. And this guy was a painter. And he was, if you think some of you are obsessive, this guy was obsessive. He painted in a little area of woodland called Stoke Woods outside Exeter for 26 years, 365 days of the year, whatever. He'd get up on Christmas Day, hear your presents, kids, get on his bike and go and paint. Completely obsessive character. And all his paintings look the same. Bloody good painter. And I said to him one day, we were having a conversation in the common room. I love it where these things start off. And I said to him, so where's it all coming from? What's it all about? And he said, it's very, very simple. He said, when I go into the middle of a piece of woodland, if you could imagine yourself just entering into a piece of woodland and looking about, and you've got a piece of paper and a pencil, how on earth does an artist make a set of decisions to somehow or other deal with the insane complexity of what is present before them in the canopy of a wood? Tens of millions of leaves and twigs and so on. So how on earth do you begin to make a mark that deals with the complexity? And that's what he'd been dealing with for 26 years, just working away at that problem through paint, using the same palette even, just working away. And so on the day of his retirement, so another one of these, a lot of pathos in this story, the day of his retirement, he had a party in the woods. He was a bit of a loner, this man. And we went out to the woods and he had a lovely party, during the course of which he developed a nosebleed. But before he developed a nosebleed, I'm jumping ahead of myself in the story here, he said to me, "Have you ever seen my pond?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, I've built this pond in the middle of the wood. You ought to go and see it." And for my series of ponds, I really wanted a woodland pond. So I loved the idea of finding a circular space with a sort of no canopy above it, just going up into space. So I said, "Oh, Mike, that sounds great." Anyway, then he developed the nosebleed. Then 3 or 4 days later, I said to my colleagues at work, "Wasn't that fantastic, dude? Didn't we have a lovely day?" And they said, "Didn't you hear what happened?" And I said, "No, what happened?" And he said, "Well, guy had a huge tumor cut out of his head the next day. This nosebleed, he'd worked for 35 years. The day he retired, he discovered he had a huge tumor in his head." And so anyway, I went to the pond, and I found, look, if you look at this picture, here's his pond. You can see his easel. I don't know if this thing works. There's his easel. Okay, very strange guy, because if he was painting, he didn't believe if he wanted to make a picture and there was a twig in the way, he didn't snap it. He got a piece of string and he sort of gradually pulled it out the way, and then when he finished the painting, he let it back. So there are all these little odd bits of string and stuff here. So his presence is in the wood. And for 2 years, I went back to this pond and made a study. And what I wanted to do originally was to say to myself, what happens when, as a photographer, I deal with this same question? You know, if you're dealing with how, when you walk into a space this complicated, you begin to make decisions about where am I going to point the camera? What am I going to make pictures of? And so that's what I was thinking about originally. And so I was interested in the pond. So I started making this picture, and I shot over 2 years, just about 50 or 60 negs. And he got better again. He started painting, and then he got iller again. He eventually died 2 years later. And during the course of the pictures, there's a couple of narratives going on. There's this business about how do you photograph, you know, the decisions you make when you're making some pictures. But gradually through the series of pictures, signs of his presence gradually erode. He never took anything away, and they just fall in. And again, it's another allegorical piece for me about sort of, you know, an artist striving. We all, you know, work like hell and we make our stuff. I was talking to Joe yesterday. What's going to happen to it all? Well, the likelihood is that it'll all just sort of, you know, fall in. And gradually through this series, he disappears. So this is called The Painter's Pool. There's a copy of a book outside published by Nasralli. And there's a short essay about him and his painting in the back. And also a very simple celebration about, again, the seasons and so on. So all of that's very much embedded in the pictures. I think one thing I want to just say, I should have said it earlier on, and I kind of said it at the beginning, that I don't want to give you the impression that all of this is just endlessly driven by making these big pieces of work. I call making the architecture of a piece of work, starting with a very simple sort of place and an idea, and then gradually photographing and creating an edifice, really, out of a series of pictures and texts. But actually, just to remind you, what really drives me is the problem of each day of how do I make a picture today? That's what's really, really exciting. So let's not forget about that. And notions of complexity and visual complexity have become ever more sort of challenging and interesting to sort of engage with. Mark making, thinking about the relationship between photography and painting and mark making and drawing, these kinds of relationships. Green, we've talked a lot about green today. I've got my own personal theory about why green doesn't work, apart from the fact that this double pixel capture slightly exaggerates the, you know, and the degrees. My theory about green, just to chuck it in, David, is that you talked about how many, 44,000 different? 40,000, okay. One of the reasons why greens are so difficult to deal with is because our eyes are so sensitive to the nuances of green. So we look at this, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of different greens in here. And the photographic medium, unfortunately, is really crude when it comes to sort of expressing and working through the nuances. So I think we're doubly, trebly more sensitive to where the nuances of greens don't really work, because it's the colour that our eyes are most sort of sensitive to. So just kind of finally, but this is sort of be a long finale, perhaps. Okay. So this is the last piece of work, or two pieces of work I'm going to talk about. And this piece of work has a conceptual origin, unlike almost everything that I've been talking to you about today. And Raphael was talking about the conceptual sort of premises. They're very important to me. This one actually started with a conceptual premise. And again, it's another one of these wonderful, wonderful accidents. About 25 years ago, I was in the office of a colleague, and a woman came in the door, and she said, Elizabeth, you must meet Jem, because you're both interested in rivers. And we had about a 15-minute conversation. And she was a geographer who taught geography to teach within the context of teacher training, if that makes sense. In other words, she taught geography teachers how to teach geography. That was her job. And she'd been carrying out a sort of a personal project for many years, which she briefly told me about just for a few minutes. And what she'd been doing was that she'd been going into school classrooms in primary schools for many years, and she'd once a year go into a classroom, and she'd hand every kid in the classroom a piece of paper, an A4 piece of paper, and a pencil, and say, draw a river. And she just gathered them in and looked at them, and then the next year go back and say the same thing. And what she was interested in, was it possible, looking at the drawings, to detect signs of when a child's understanding begins to develop a clever kind of conceptual sort of depth of understanding. Can you see in the drawings a moment or a period or a time when knowledge and experience goes from the sort of direct into a more conceptual kind of space? And I thought, wow, that's just a beautiful thing to have done. I've never seen any of her drawings. I've never seen her again. That was it, just one off. But it laid buried. It was a seed that laid buried. And about 2005, I was asked to give a paper to a group of cultural geographers at Nottingham. They go very, very strong. This is where this guy, Nick Allfrey, teaches. Very, very strong cultural geography department there. A guy called Stephen Daniels, who writes brilliantly about landscape. And the theme was on rivers. So I said to myself, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down my street with some pieces of paper, hand them out to any kids I can lasso, give them a pencil and say, draw a river. I'm going to show you the results now, some of them. So these are the results. Oscar, aged 8. Look at that. Yeah, that's the eldest kid. Now, I just thought, this is a tiny sample, but I thought these are amazing. So I showed them to this group of cultural geographers, and we're talking about now some of the really, really top people in the country, geographers and so on. And they were sort of saying, oh, sweet, aren't they nice, sort of thing. So I said to them, well, which one of you is actually going to stand up and define a river? Absolutely say what a river is. How can you? And they all sort of, actually, what a point. Because, what a river is completely beyond anybody's ability to describe it. It's just such an extraordinarily wide-ranging, profound kind of thing. But what was fascinating another thing that was fascinating about these drawings was there are all sorts of odd things that intrigued me. So, for instance, we noticed that a lot of them start on the top right and flow down to the bottom left. I have no idea what's going on there, because I thought about left-handed, right-handed, they were mixed. Wasn't anything to do with that. Amazingly sophisticated. Look at people understand turbulence patterns. They're all dealing with turbulence patterns on the surface. These little round things interested me. I started looking at these things here. And there's lots of them. Look, round things. Round things. And then I thought, well, look, these are middle-class kids. They live in Exeter. If they see a river, it'd probably be a Dartmoor river. These are Dartmoor streams they're drawing. So so then I started developing this premise for making a piece of work, and this is the basis of the premise. That there's nowhere in our minds that what a river is sort of neatly encapsulated. We haven't got a little neurological space somewhere or other, which is sort of, this is what a river is. And when someone asks you what is a river, you just sort of, it comes out. The mind and memory doesn't work like that. What happens is that memory basically is an active building kind of process and principle. I'm not a sort of a psychologist, but I've done a bit of reading, and I think this is what some people kind of now argue. So when someone says to you, what is a river? Depending upon who you are, what your expertise is, what your mode of communication is, if you're a cartographer, you'd start drawing lines. If you're a novelist, you might start kind of writing or something or other. That basically the act of answering the question draws out the understanding from the imagination, from the mind. So when one of these children starts to draw, they don't have this thing in their mind. They basically make a mark, and then they'll make another mark, and then they'll draw something or other, and then they'll put a hill in. It grows. The answer basically is that it's an active process of understanding. So anyway, rather interesting, this one, in terms of this idea of how conceptually people begin to understand what a river is. So this actually happens to be my youngest daughter. She was about 10 or 11 at the time, and she was the only one who drew any tributaries. All the rest are just straight streams. So I said to her, this is really interesting. You've drawn these other streams, And she said, yes. And I said, but they're at an odd angle because, they're coming up into the river. And she said, well, the water flows down the river and then up these little streams. So she'd got the idea of a tributary, but she hadn't really understood the flow dynamics and so on. More turbulence, look, more rocks. Anyway, I built a piece of work based on this. So what I decided to do was to make a piece of work very, very simply. So I'm going to pick a river, and I'm going to define what a river is. I'm going to articulate what a river is by photographing one. That's how I'm going to sort of make a piece of work. And it was a wonderfully liberating thing for me personally to do, because it meant that was the sort of the limit of my conceptual sort of premise. It was just, let's see what happens when I set out to make a river through the act of photographing one. So I picked the River Exe, and I started in about 2008, and over the last, how long is that, 6-7 years, I've been going back to about 15 or 18 places, not that many. I haven't by any means explored the whole river, and started going back and just making pictures in the same places again, and it's been a hugely enjoyable experience. This is a place called Bickley. This is the main river, and so I must have about maybe 30-40 pictures of Bickley now. These are some of them. These are within about 50-100 meters of one another, and so it's this practice again about going back to a very small place and trying to forge, make and push out an interesting picture. By just continually the discipline and the fascination with that. So these are all Bickley. And then I thought, well, of course, rivers have sources, but they don't have one source. They've got hundreds of sources. Everywhere where water wells up in the ground and within a river basin is a source. So I started making a small series of studies of river sources. So this is one of those. This is a place called Newton St Sires, very near Exeter. And also rivers have tributaries, but not only do they have tributaries, they have hundreds, thousands of small, tiny streams, what I call unnamed streams, that are all part of the sort of feeding in process. So this is one of these unnamed streams. So I started photographing lots of what I call unnamed streams. And to give you an idea of how, it's just really interesting thing to do, there was one of these little streams which was called Ladybrook. And it flowed for about 2 miles. And then it joined another stream and it became the River Calvary. And then it joined another stream about less than a mile further on, it became the River Yeo. And that flowed for about 2 miles into the River Creedy, which 4 miles later flowed into the River Exe. So if you took that as a single stream of water, within 10 miles, you've got 5 or 6 different name pieces of river. So I would put things together like that. This is just one of these weird anecdotes. This is one of my favorite little spots, beautiful little stream, this. And I went back here 2 years ago after, years of photographing it. And there's a footpath. There's one thing I should say about this work is that, there's a little footpath running through this wood. And there was a sign on the footpath, not a very big one, but basically said danger, warning. And when you look closer, it said wild boars now roam freely in this area. It's only 2-3 miles from the centre of Exeter. And the whole of this valley has just been trampled to bits and dug up by the boars. They've completely and utterly smashed this rather glorious space to smithereens. Although someone told me last week that they've just been, they've killed them at last. Bit bizarre, isn't it? 3 miles from where you're living in the middle of Devon, there are wild boars. They were set out by one of these animal liberation groups that freed a whole lot of boars in North Devon, and now they're all over the county, apparently. This is the River Creedy, so there's 7 tributaries feeding into the Exe, so I started making a series of pictures of tributaries. This is the Creedy. And then something else, of course, is that rivers are dynamic. We've heard Paul and other people talking about the sheer dynamism of energy. This is taken a week after that for that picture there. So this is exactly the same tree. So by God, is this a sort of dynamic? This is a heavily, heavily flooding river. So I'm wanting to deal also with this river isn't just a single sort of flow. It has all sorts of different states and spates and so on. Anyway, now we really are getting near the end. In November 2011, I think, I don't take many pictures during the summer, so between March 2011 and early November, I didn't take any pictures. And I picked the camera up again, and I went back to the woods. This is the Painter's Pool again, after the guy died. Oops, no, what am I doing? So, this is the pool. So I go back to these places. I was here last week just making another couple of pictures, so I love going back. But look, a confluence of streams again. This is the confluence of 2 unnamed streams. I love this space where these 2 unnamed streams join together. I went back and made this picture. And I had a fantastic spate of picture making. So I might take anything, in that 1996 I shot 12 negs, literally shot 12 pictures. But now my kids are near, I've got a bit more time. And I shot about 40 negs in 3 months, which is extraordinary production for me, really going it. Just photographing in a number of places along the river. Look, we've seen a picture of this tree before, it's another picture of this tree. And I was loving it. I was having a very, very productive time, really enjoying it, still thinking about this river project. And then something happened which completely changed the whole body of work. This is the same little wood that the boars now run through, another picture of that. This is elite, so I'm interested in all the dynamics of well, not all of them, but lots of the different dynamics of what a river system sort of consists of. So this is now middle of December. And then one night, something that's never happened in all the years I've lived in Exeter before, the snow really fell. We had this incredible night of snow. And my wife and I got up in about 5 or 6 o'clock, realized it was snowing. We went out for this long, long walk. And we went up round the hill and then came back down through the university campus. Now, I never photograph from the university campus because one of my little sort of decisions is that I'm not the least bit interested in photographing places, particularly that are sort of designed and manufactured. I'm not interested in going to parks or anything. What I like is sort of photographing places that become the way they are because of the processes that are driving them, which is what's so interesting about a beach or a mining area, because the processes that are sort of unfolded during those things actually create the landscape that you find. So this was a highly managed landscape with these small ponds, but it was so exquisite. So I couldn't get out in the car, so I started taking photographs in the snow. And then I had an idea, and I said, wow, I'm going to work on a completely new piece of work. I'd never thought about doing this before. I'm going to photograph winter. And I'm going to photograph winter, just one winter, by going from late autumn through to the first signs of spring. And I want to make a piece of work about just one winter, the transition of a single winter. And I had in mind this poem by Edward Thomas, wonderful poet and writer and walker. So over the land freckled with snow half thawed, and the speculating rooks at their nest cawed, and saw from elm tops, delicate as flowers of grass, what we below could not see, winter pass. So I had this idea of trying to make a piece of work about the transition of a single winter. And so I just kept photographing. So this is a week after that first snow fell, so the same sort of viewpoint going back, and just kept going. And I photographed through to the first signs of spring. And that book became The River Winter. And it's one of the most enjoyable sort of experience I've had. I really enjoyed working on this series. And in the book, what I wanted to do, this was very much thought, I've never shown any of these pictures, although I will. Hans, I'll be seeing you hopefully in Stockholm. They're going to be shown in Artipelag in May in Stockholm, a series of them, if you're around in May. So what I wanted to do with the book, I love making books, like putting books together, was to have just a sequence of photographs, 40 pictures, 30 pictures, I don't know how many. But I wanted an essay, and I asked this friend of mine, a guy I know, a man called Richard Hamblin, brilliant writer on history of geography, science of geography, to write an essay. And I gave him a very specific brief. And he wrote this fantastic essay. And what the essay does, it looks at 14,000 years of winters, 14,000 years of winters, because what I wanted to do was to place this one winter against how winter as a phenomena has, in a sense, seeped into our imaginations during the time that we have been here since the last ice age. Completely different from a Scandinavian winter, completely different from a Mediterranean winter. But the thesis is that those of us from Belgium, France, Britain, winter is a very particular thing, and it's very, very powerfully lodged in our imagination. And so he's written this wonderful essay that looks at literature and painting and writing and also the history of the winters, and put that against this single winter. So one looks at one winter and 14,000. This is one of the last pictures. So here we have the very first buds of spring. And there's one of the illustrations that we use from a Bruegel painting in the book. I've finished. Thank you very much. Okay?
Yeah. Well, not surprisingly, I suppose we're running a little late. There was no way I was going to interrupt Jem because it was fantastic.
Sorry about that.
No. It was a fantastic exposition. It was really interesting to see the thought behind your work, and I thought it was fabulous. We're not going to do a question and answer session now because we are running a little bit late. So Jem will be around during the day tomorrow and here for dinner for those of you who are joining us for the dinner. So if you want to pose any questions for Jem, please do feel free to do that. But yeah, just to say thank you again, Jem, because it was really, really fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you for the invite, and thanks for being so patient. Yeah.